Welcome to Truth Sentinel, watching over the truth in the news. So today we're going to talk about MH370 and give an update 2 years on. We spoke about MH370 before in another episode which you can find on YouTube. Just go to YouTube, type in Truth Sentinel with Scott. There's 2 channels there, and please subscribe. In this episode we spoke to Sarah Bajak, whose partner Philip Wood was on the plane, and we also spoke to Jeff Wise, an aviation analyst who spoke to us about some of his theories, and he's going to be joining us again later. Just wanted to say hello and welcome all the listeners out there who are listening on the digital networks or listening on YouTube, and just wanted to say that you can always come and contribute at www.truthsentinel.co.uk. Leave us messages there, leave voicemails with your ideas and with ideas for guests and suggestions for shows. We'd very much like to hear from you. So let's get on with today's show anyway. So the last 9 months have been a very trying time for the families connected to MH370, especially after the flapper-on was found on Reunion Island, and it looked like the mystery may have been solved. Since then, that finding and many others have been called into question. The Malaysian government's handling of the issue has been either totally incompetent or totally corrupt, and the search has made little progress. The relatives are now no closer to finding out the fate of their loved ones, and the mystery has deepened. Later we'll go and speak to Anthony Kay, our academic researcher in Kazakhstan, and also to Jeff Wise as mentioned. But before we do that, let's speak to someone who's connected to this situation in a much more direct way. We're going to talk to Grace Nathan, whose mother Anne Daisy was on board MH370. Grace, thanks for talking to us. I know it can't be easy to go through this again, but can you take us back to the very beginning? How did you find out your mother was on board MH370?
Well, I was in England at the time when the plane went missing, so it was about 1 a.m. Saturday morning in England when I received a call from my dad. Of course, I found it quite odd that he was calling me at such a late hour, and I assumed that it was my mom trying to call me to tell me she had arrived. She always forgets that there's a time difference, and she calls me at the worst possible time sometimes. So I picked up the phone, and then my dad called, and he was it was him on the phone, not my mom. And he asked me, when is your next exam? Because I was in the middle of my final exams at the time. He asked me, when is your next exam? And I said, Monday. And then he said okay, and hung up. And I found it really, really odd that he called me just to ask me when my next exam was. He didn't even say hello, how are you, or anything. And I was a little bit nervous. I felt like something didn't seem right. But then after a couple of minutes, he called me again, and I could pick up that there was a lot of panic in his voice. And then he said to me get on the next flight and come home. And then I remember just shivering, because I by that point I already knew that something must have happened to either my mother or my sister for my dad to sound that panicked. I also had my grandmother had just come out of quite a serious surgery. So my first impression when my dad asked when my next exam was, I thought maybe something happened to my grandma. But when he called back the second time and he sounded so panicked, I knew it couldn't have been my grandma. It must have been either my mom or my sister. And then and I asked him why, and when he said to me, just get on the next flight home. And I asked him why. He said, don't ask me any questions, just get on the next flight home. And I remember at that point that I just I ran up to my room, because I just walked through the front door. I ran up to my room and I just went to the computer, and I was really very scared. I didn't know what to think. I wasn't functioning. I remember feeling very, very restless. And I kept calling him back, trying to ask him what happened. And then eventually, he told me, something's happened to the plane your mother was on, but we don't know what happened. And at this point, I remember just dropping my phone, it just slipped out of my hand, and I remember just shivering. And I don't know, I didn't know what to think. I remember just reaching for my passport and walking out the door, and I headed to the coach station and got on the first coach to Heathrow, because I was in Bristol at the time. It was a 3-hour journey to Heathrow. And I remember while on the coach, I was checking my phone, I was updating, looking at Google updates every 2 minutes. And I remember just being so scared, because there were so many rumors out there about that the plane had crashed, that there were bodies floating everywhere. There were a lot of false people coming forward with false information, that they saw an explosion in the sky or something. And I remember just being really, really scared. But it was always the news sources that were carrying these news weren't any reputable sites. So I didn't pay too much heed to it, but it was still very, very nerve-wracking nonetheless. And by the time I got to the airport, I think my dad had called ahead and he had organized my ticket for me. So I just got on the only flight available at the time, like the fastest flight that I could get on was the Malaysian Airlines flight, and it was also the only direct flight. So I had to take a Malaysian Airlines flight back to KL, and it was I think just slightly over 14 hours, the flight. And I remember that this was the most agonizing 14 hours of my life because I
Mm.
couldn't check my phone. I just didn't know what to think. I didn't know I didn't know, like, in 14 hours so much can happen. I didn't know whether they would have found the plane by the time, whether they would have found all the people by the time I landed, whether they would have discovered that the plane had crashed. I remember not even being able to look out of the window because I was so scared. Like, I was like, because in my mind, all these thoughts like, oh my God, what if the plane crashed into the sea? And I just remember crying like almost the entire flight. And when I reached KL, when the flight landed, a mass official came to greet me at the plane. And I remember I think I practically ran up to him and I said to him, "Do you have any information?" And he said, "No, they still haven't found the plane." And at that moment, I remember feeling like a slight relief, because
Mm.
in my mind, it was like, well, if they haven't found them, I think they haven't found a crash site, or they haven't found there's no bad news. I think no news is good news, sort of thing.
Yeah.
It was something like that. And then my dad had just flown in from Beijing, so I met him at the airport, and together we went to this hotel where they were gathering all the next of kin.
Okay.
And we went to this hotel, and it was just so chaotic. There were people everywhere. There wasn't even anywhere to stand or sit. The place was swarming with press. And I remember just not, I at this point in time, like, I wasn't able to think. My dad kept breaking down into tears, and I've never seen my dad cry before.
I imagine the
Yeah.
atmosphere in that room must have been not too good either, yeah?
Yeah, and also because I kept feeling like, oh my God, my dad's crying. What do I do? Like, he's the one that's supposed to be the head of the home. He's supposed to be the strong one. And like, I felt this pressure upon myself that no one had put there, but I just felt this pressure that, like, I needed to now step up and be strong for my family, sort of thing. But eventually, when we went to the hotel, we spent 5 minutes there, and like, we just couldn't be in that environment. So we just went home. My sister was at home waiting for us, so we just went home. And since that day, we sort of just stayed at home and watched TV. We didn't go for any of the briefings or anything that they had, because we just couldn't subject ourselves to the press. And they were live telecast anyhow, the briefings, so like we just watched it on TV at home.
And how did you feel about the constant news coverage and speculation about what happened to the plane?
It was like being on pins and needles for like the next couple of weeks, until the Prime Minister came out and prematurely announced that they assumed that the flight had ended in the South Indian Ocean, and that everyone was presumed to be dead.
That must have been quite devastating news, and quite strange, really, considering they didn't have any information to base that on.
Yeah, I mean, I guess him saying that the most possible solution is that the plane had ended in the South Indian Ocean would have sufficed. He didn't need to go the extra mile and say, and we presume no one that would have survived. Something, I mean, that just saying it sort of
Mm.
hurt so much, like having to hear that. I mean, especially for us who, we obviously were up to that point still really, really hoping that the plane was hijacked, or what might have landed somewhere. I mean, after all, it had vanished. There was nothing to indicate that the plane was in the South Indian Ocean. And at that point, I think they were still looking at the two arcs, the southern arc and the northern arc, and they just picked the southern arc. There wasn't enough information at the point to tell us why they picked the southern arc.
And they've literally stayed with that ever since, and the
Yeah.
search hasn't revealed anything. Do you feel like they should have entertained other possibilities too?
I mean, I at the time, if they felt that that was the best place to look, or that was the only place to look, I feel like that is well and fine. But now that they have spent better part of 2 years looking in that same area, and they haven't yielded a single result. It's not even that they found some parts of the plane, nothing. They haven't found anything at all. I think that now it is time for them to. I know they say that they want to stop searching in June or July. I don't believe that that is the solution. I don't think that they should stop searching in June or July. I believe that they should instead go back to the drawing board, perhaps, and re-evaluate, reinvestigate, and restart if necessary. They have to be open to the idea that there may have been a mistake, that there may have been some sort of human error in the calculations that they made. They did, after all, use data that had never been used before. They used formulas that have never been used before. And there must have been some leaps or some guesses that they made to reach their conclusion,
That's
because
right.
they only had some limited data. And I just think that they need to at least be open to the possibility that they've made mistakes. Even looking at a lot of other things that have happened since, for example, when they found the flaperon, they found it on the coast, they found it on La Reunion, like near Africa. when drift modeling had predicted that any debris would show up on the shores of Australia or Indonesia, but no, it showed up on the shores of Africa.
The news articles, it often, with the recent finding in Mozambique, which possibly might be from MH370, it's not confirmed, I don't believe, but
Yeah.
the articles always say that transcribes to the current drift models.
Yes, but that drift model was recalibrated and the new drift model was produced after they found the flaperon with the benefit of hindsight. But if
Yeah.
they could have made that kind of mistake while projecting into the future for the drift models, then what other mistakes could they have made? We're not saying it's intentional, but there is a chance that there was some human error.
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, there's some discrepancies between the BTO and BFO data, for example.
Yeah.
What's your current feelings about these pieces of debris that are found in Reunion and Mozambique more recently?
I'm not entirely convinced about the debris that showed up on La Reunion. I mean, I know they've confirmed it, but I don't know. Just personally, I didn't feel very convinced that it was from MH370 for many reasons. First of all, like they say that debris should float in fields, but they never found anything else except this very, very tiny piece. And also, I mean, based on science, they said a lot of things about how it was quite unlikely that this flaperon would have made the journey from the South Indian Ocean up to and made it to the shores of La Reunion in the time that it did. Because if it did, it would have had to travel 7 miles in a straight line every day. And given how light and how small it is, and that it had to be submerged for the barnacles to grow, that it's unlikely that it made that journey. And several other things that I've read or picked up along the way. There were just so many inconsistencies, and just that so many pieces didn't match that it's difficult to just say, I'm 100% convinced that this is part of the plane. But separate and apart from that, even if the flaperon was part of MH370, it still didn't give us any of the answers we wanted. Like, it still didn't tell us where the plane is. It didn't tell us what happened to the plane or why it happened to the plane. So we are still none the better 2 years on.
Yeah, and the ID tag's missing from that as well, and there's been no report from the French authorities on that yet.
Yeah, it suddenly became very quiet.
What's changed since everything started in terms of what you know and how you feel?
In terms of what I know, nothing has changed. In terms of how I feel, everything has changed. So it's quite a difficult situation to be in because I mean I for one have deteriorated over the past 2 years on an emotional level. My levels of motivation or my desire, my passion, my lust for life, if you would call it that, is basically gone. I cannot find joy doing the things that I used to love doing. I used to be a highly motivated, highly driven person, but these days I find it really hard to just get out of bed. And it scares me because I don't know if I will ever go back to being the person that I once was. And it scares me to feel this way, to be this way.
And do you get any comfort from talking with other families?
Yeah, to some extent, because I feel like the other families at least know what I'm going through because they're in the same boat as me. Because outside of speaking to them, I feel quite lonely. I mean, I'm surrounded by a lot of people that love and care for me, and I'm lucky that I have so many people who love and care for me. But it doesn't change the fact that I sometimes feel very, very lonely because I feel like they just don't understand what I'm going through.
Are there any questions? I'm sure there are, but are there any questions that you feel, which questions in particular would you like answered, and do you think that possibly could be answered?
I think that they should just, for now, I mean, I know that they don't have a lot to give us, a lot of answers to give us because they themselves don't have the information, it seems. But I would at least hope that, they could give us the assurance that they will continue looking for the answers that we need. Like, what happened to the plane? Why did it happen? What caused it to happen? And not just for us as the next of kin who are in desperate need of some information for closure, for recovery, to heal from all this, but also in the interest of aviation safety. I think that everyone stands to benefit, especially the flying public, that we all stand to benefit from them finding this plane and finding out what happened to it. Because until they do that, how do we prevent something like this from happening again?
I totally agree. I fly a lot, and I certainly want to know what's happened with this situation. And it seems like the relationship with Malaysian Airlines and with the Malaysian government is not great between the families as well. Some families are suing Malaysian Airlines, I believe. What can you tell us about the legalities at the moment?
Well, I mean, we're obviously put in a very tight position in terms of time because the Montreal Convention gives us 2 years from the date of the accident to begin legal action against the airline. And because in this situation we have absolutely no knowledge, a lot of people have had to wait until the 11th hour literally before making a decision. Because I mean, you just keep hoping something will turn up or something will come up that will help you make this decision. But well, and then you wait until you really cannot wait anymore, and then you have to make a choice between accepting a settlement that has been put forward through Masters Insurance Alliance or going to court. And the thing is that, like, both options are quite bleak. It's just about picking the lesser of two evils, because right now you don't know, there is no right choice, because you don't know what's going to happen a few months down the road or a few weeks down the road. Even like, if the discovery of the new debris is any indication, with us things can change at a drop of a hat. You just don't know when it's going to change. And you might think that maybe you would take the settlement, but taking the settlement would mean that you would waive your right to sue any other party going forward. And a lot of people that I've spoken to feel that it's really very premature to so confidently waive your rights to sue anyone going forward, because you don't know what's happened yet.
Very true. I mean, there could be some negligence in this situation because they were tracking the plane, but they sort of seem to lose it somehow. I also heard that Malaysian Airlines it may have changed the name of the airline, and there's been some speculation whether that was to avoid liabilities. Do you think that's the case?
Well, I mean, we cannot say for sure what their reasons are, but from our perspective, it looks like it may have been one of the reasons that they changed their name. I mean, they say to the public that it was a rebranding exercise, but I fail to see how it's a rebranding exercise when they fly under the same flagship. The airline is still called Malaysian Airlines, and they still have the same CEO, they still have all of the same staff. Nothing much has changed except the company name, which also changed ever so slightly.
There is an upcoming remembrance event. What's being planned for that event?
Well, the event is supposed to be a tribute for all our loved ones that are on board. We just want to remember that even though 2 years has passed, like, that we still remember them, we still miss them. Nothing has changed for us in that regard. And we also, at the same time, hope to basically bring to the public's attention why there is a real and important need to find this plane, not just for us, but also in the interest of aviation safety, because we definitely do not want to see this happen to anyone in the future. Like, we know how bad it's been for us, and we really don't want to see it happen again. And we don't want what happened to our loved ones to have happened in vain. We believe that we should learn from what has happened, and we should try to prevent it.
What can people do if they want to support you in any way, either in person or online?
We have a petition that is available online and also will be available at the event. And they can come forward to sign this petition. It's a search on petition, basically to urge the governments that are in a position to either exercise pressure or provide funds for a continued search to do so. And then we are also running a search on campaign to help raise awareness, and we've been collecting videos from people who want for the search to go on from all over the world, and we've been compiling these videos, and we've been making a trailer out of them.
And to get that petition, what would they have to type in the search on Google, for example?
They could search on Facebook for the MH370 Families page. It's called MH370 Families Association, and the petition is available on that page. That's probably the easiest way.
Thanks for joining us, Grace. I certainly wish you all the best and support you. And if we can help any time, please contact us if you need to speak to us again about anything.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
I really
Grace.
appreciate it.
Take it easy.
Bye.
We wish all the families, especially at this time of the year, all the best, and we support them. Next, we're going to go to speak to Anthony Kay, who's over there in Kazakhstan. And we're going to speak to Jeff Wise, who has a theory which is linked to Kazakhstan, incidentally. Let's go over to them now. So we're going to speak to Jeff Wise about MH370 next. He's joining us again for an update as the 2-year anniversary of the plane's disappearance is near. It's been a long, agonising wait for any kind of explanation as to what's happened to the plane for the families of those on board, as you can hear from the interview with Grace Nathan, who I spoke to earlier. So we're going to speak to Jeff, who's a science writer and author of Extreme Fear, The Science of Your Mind in Danger. He's written articles for Time, Business Week, The New York Times, Men's Journal, Psychology Today, Popular Mechanics, and others. He also wrote a book called The Plane That Wasn't There, about MH370. He appeared on CNN in relation to the plane's disappearance, and he also runs a website where people contribute ideas and information about MH370. As mentioned before, Jeff finally hit the big time when he came on Truth Sentinel to discuss MH370, and then again on our episode about the psychology of fear. Welcome back, Jeff.
Hey, it's a great pleasure to be back. Thank you.
Yeah, it's nice to speak to you again. So, some things have happened since we last spoke. Do we know any more about MH370?
I feel like we know a lot more about MH370. I mean, the thing that I've been following is the fact, well, there's a bunch of things actually. The first thing is that the Australians have searched now almost 100,000 square kilometers of the seabed in high detail and not found anything. They found other things. They know that this technology works. They found shipwrecks, but they have not found any trace of this plane. And what is becoming increasingly clear is that the plane isn't there. And what that means is that the plane could not have flown on autopilot alone after it disappeared from radar. And that's a big thing, because a lot of the theories that have been popular have been things like, well, maybe there was a fire and the pilots became incapacitated, or maybe a pilot committed suicide, or maybe there was some kind of a fight, as we saw on one of the United planes after 9/11. All of those essentially can be ruled out now, which is huge. And I would argue, and I think this is generally becoming more accepted, that there's only two things that are left, two possibilities. One is that the pilot committed suicide and stayed awake the entire time, and at the end, after the plane ran out of fuel, he held it into a glide to prolong his agony, which doesn't seem to make much sense psychologically, but is by far the mainstream of these two views. The second one, which pretty much only I hold right now, is that the plane didn't go south at all, and that it was flown actively to the north. Some parameters in the satellite communications equipment were changed to make it look like it was going south, but it actually went north. I would argue most likely into Kazakhstan. Some people have suggested China, but one of these two places.
So you haven't abandoned the Kazakhstan theory. Is there any more evidence that the data could have been spoofed, do you think?
I think there's a major piece of evidence in that regard, which is what I was going to bring up next, which is that a piece of airplane was found on a beach in Mozambique by probably one of your listeners, actually, a guy named Blaine Allen Gibson, who has sort of tirelessly and on his own dime been scouring the Indian Ocean region, talking to people, looking for clues, and he's been very open-minded. He's been, really checking out theories that a lot of us, including me, think are ridiculous and sort of fringy and not really based in science. But he's been very open-minded, and he was on vacation in Mozambique. Boy, last week, I guess it was now. He was on vacation, but he thought, well, I'm here. I might as well see if I can find something. So we had some boatmen take him out to a sandbar. And sure enough, the boatman said, hey, look at this. And handed him a chunk of what seriously looks like it could be a piece of a 777. And so a lot of us are very excited about this. We don't really know, as has happened too often in this case, the authorities are being fairly tight-lipped. When the flatbron was found on Reunion Island, almost immediately you had people flooding the internet with images of what flatbrons really look like, and people have said, here's a schematic showing where it is. With this piece, we haven't seen anything like that. This is presumed to be a part of the leading edge of a right horizontal stabilizer. So it's part of the tail. It's the part that looks like a little wing, and this would be the skin of the front of the part of that that's next to the vertical stabilizer, the vertical part of the tail. And so he found it, and he emailed me and said, this is what I've got. What do you think? And I emailed him. I said, do not give this to the Malaysians. Please do not give this to the Malaysians. But what he did is he wrapped it up. He took it to Maputo, the capital, and he gave it to the head of the Civil Aviation Authority there, and they turned it over to the Malaysians. So I don't know if we'll ever really get a good look at this thing, but what's really intriguing about it is it doesn't seem to have any kind of marine life on it at all. And so I spent a lot of time after the Reunion flatbron turned up talking to a lot of marine biologists and talking to people who are experts in marine fouling and the things that grow on things that are put in the water, and learned a lot about the particular genus of goose barnacle that was found on that piece. There's nothing on this piece. I mean, it looks like it's out of the box. And so that's raised a lot of eyebrows. And the circumstances under which it was found have raised a lot of eyebrows.
But doesn't increased amount of debris sort of point away from the Kazakhstan theory, or are you saying these could possibly be planted?
To me, it looks very much looks planted. And I think we need to, this is where we would need to really consult with some marine biologists. We ideally would get in the hands of people who are experts in this kind of thing. My experience growing up on the ocean is that stuff that washes ashore does not look like it just came out of a box. It's like kind of a brutal process to be tossed around in the ocean and washed up on a beach. Things grow on things. But, then again, some people have argued, well, maybe it was tossed around in the sand and kind of got sand blasted and everything was kind of eroded off. It's hard to really say, but I mean, we don't know. But you asked me if there's any evidence. I mean, I would say that if the marine biologists look at it and say, this is from a 777, and it doesn't look like it's spent any time in the ocean, I would say that would be powerful evidence for a spoof. I fully expect to get pushback on that. I think a lot of people are going to disagree with me, but this is, in fact, the kind of hard physical evidence that I've been hoping for that would settle the issue one way or the other.
Can I ask? So last time we spoke, it was not too long after the reunion flaperon had turned up, and the story of the
Right.
barnacles was just starting to emerge. I read a little bit about the barnacles, and what I read suggested to me that these barnacles were not consistent. There was something kind of not quite right about the barnacles. Can you explain that?
Right. So yeah, I spent a lot of time. So these were the piece was covered in a kind of barnacle called lepus. It's a goose barnacle, and these things evolved to float around in the open ocean. And their life cycle is very quick because in nature, the kinds of things that they would raft onto, pieces of wood, pieces of seaweed, maybe, by nature kind of decay and sink ultimately. So they have a very accelerated lifestyle. So they grow very quickly. And there's only about 6 or 7 people really in the world who really focus on these animals because they're generally just considered a nuisance. They have no economic value. And so there have been a few papers done about the growth rates of these things. And I did a kind of rough and dirty image analysis comparing the pictures of the flaperon to, looking at images of the flaperon and comparing them to other objects of known dimension in the same image. And I worked out that the biggest of these barnacles are about 2.3 centimeters, which would seem to correspond to a barnacle that's maybe 4 to 6 months old, generously. Mm-hmm. And obviously, if this piece has been in the water for 15 months, as it should have been at that point, where was it the other 8 months or 9 months? Mm-hmm. And it might have been that it started out in water that was too far to the south and too cold for the lepus barnacles to start to grow. But based on the drift modeling that we have, then it should have been in warm waters within a few months because the currents there generally drift northward. So it raised a major issue. Now, to me, it's only, it's not open and shut case. I mean, what we would, and all the biologists I talked to said, look, we need to get samples in the hands of marine biologists. People need to look at these things. They can, measure them, look at the, use microscopes to look at the fine soft tissue of these barnacles to determine the species mix. And that could give you a clue of where they came from in the ocean. You could take samples of the shell and do an isotope analysis. That could tell you what part of the ocean it came from as well. None of this has happened. I asked each of these experts, have the French authorities contacted you? They all said no. One pair of marine biologists in Germany who are experts in this kind of thing said that they'd offered their help and were rebuffed. And so you really have to wonder what is going on. It was found at the end of July 2015, and so now it's been, I'd have to do the math, but something like 9 or 10 months.
And the French investigators, I mean, I remember when the flaperon was found, the Malaysian government, as is its habit, immediately went, yes, that's it, the mystery is solved. But the French investigators had it for 5 weeks, I think it was, before they really said anything, apart from, we think it might be from the plane, but we need to examine a little more. So they had it for quite a while, and this is a situation where, there are grieving relatives and so on who are just, their lives almost are paused while they're waiting for these investigators to make their conclusions. So what have they been doing with it all this time?
I wanted to add the ID tag's missing, isn't it, on the flaperon?
Yes, but so the serial number that should have been on the side of it was mysteriously gone. There was no evidence that it had ever been there. There was no glue or rectangular piece of paint that was missing or anything. But they did, after this month of inactivity, look inside it and find some internal numbers that matched the subcontractors' part numbers. And, apparently the story goes that because the manufacturer was an outfit in Spain, interestingly, since this was a Boeing airplane, the part was made by a subsidiary of Airbus. And I guess the story was that the Spanish workers had all just gone on vacation, and so they could, the greatest aviation mystery. You imagine all the family members, on tenterhooks, wondering, what the answer is going to be, and that these guys, like the entire factory, I guess, was on vacation. Nobody could even be bothered to look in the filing cabinet to see if the numbers matched. Ultimately, it did. The numbers did match. I've seen the pictures of that were taken inside the part. So, to me, it still does raise some questions about why they took so long. What else do they have to tell us? Why are they being so secretive? It makes you wonder if there's something funny about it. If they have done the analysis, if there's something obviously off about these barnacles or something else about the flaperon that leads them to believe it's not right. Now, you may also recall, this is a bit of an arcane footnote, but very early on, Boeing made a statement to the effect of that this flaperon doesn't quite match what it would expect to see based on the records that Malaysian Airlines kept. There was some part that was modified. I think there was some kind of they put out a service bulletin where they say, modify this part. It's about like a recall notice on a car. And apparently the work was done in not exactly the standard way and didn't quite match what was the records that Malaysia kept. So was it sloppy work or maintenance record keeping by Malaysia, or was it really something funny?
Mm-hmm. You mentioned also that, like, when this part turned up in Mozambique, when your colleague found the part, you said to him, "Don't give it to the Malaysians." Why? What happens when you turn over the evidence to the Malaysian government?
The Malaysians have been really terrible, and I was I think in the early stages of this mystery, I tried to be more politic in my language, but frankly, it's just been so frustrating. You mentioned the fact that they declared that it was from MH370 when it hadn't been definitively linked to MH370. But I mean, going back to the very beginning, it's quite famous how they let the search go on in the South China Sea when they had known for a whole week. They knew that it had gone to the west over the Malayan Peninsula and it had disappeared over the Andaman Sea. So why they let this search continue over the South China Sea is really baffling. When it became clear that the plane had gone south, they refused to turn over the Inmarsat data that had led to that conclusion. So here it was, Australia was saying, okay, go search this huge expansive ocean, and we won't give you the data that's going to tell you where to look. I mean, it's outrageous. And then, of course, now it turns out that Najib has $1 billion sitting in his bank account that no one can account for. And so, given their history of, sloppiness, and for instance, on the first year anniversary, a year ago, they had issued the charmingly named Factual Information Report, which you wonder if it's accurately named, but full of inaccuracies, just obvious blunders and mistakes, and it's hard to understand what to make of it. And so they've just done a terrible job of the investigation, and I feel like to give them a piece like this, I mean, the French have been terrible, and the Malaysians have historically been worse. I feel like the Australians have been the only players in this game who have just consistently been forthright. I some of my other colleagues in this game are really ornery and send really nasty emails to the Australians, and they always answer very politely. So I've been very impressed with the Australians, and I wish it had gone to them. And Blaine, the guy who found it, went into the office of the Mozambique civil aviation guy with the consul from Australia, but they swore up and down that they'd give it to Australia, but then they didn't. The Malaysians sent three representatives to go look at it and go pick and get it.
Do you think there's some attempt to, like a deliberate attempt to mislead the public about this on behalf of the Malaysian government, or are they just like incredibly ineptly trying to handle a crisis that they've no idea how to handle, or what's happening with them?
There's a great line in The Big Short where one guy turns to the other and says, "Is this incompetence or criminality?" And, the other guy just shrugs. He's like, take your pick, And I think that's been the story over and over again with Malaysia and this investigation. It's hard to know. Is it just incompetence or is it venality?
There does seem to be some strange things going on behind the scenes. You mentioned Najib Razak and allegations of corruption with these millions of dollars allegedly in his personal bank accounts that he says was a gift from the Saudis. And then there's the link with Anwar Ibrahim, Some people say the pilot was a supporter of his, and he found out about the news of him being arrested and sent to jail before he took off in MH370. And Anwar was making allegations of corruption as well. So there are some links here and some political and financial things that might be worth looking at. Do you think this could be the possible motivation for any kind of blackmail or hijack?
It doesn't really make sense to me. And I put up on my blog post. So basically, I decided, a couple of weeks ago that it was that it was time to kind of try to focus people's attention on the possibilities that remained, because I do feel like we've significantly reduced the realm of possibilities, that it is either suicide or spoof. And I think, as I said, the suicide, the idea that Zahari took the plane and took it on the world's longest suicide attempt, is the only one that I think gives you the plane winding up in the southern Indian Ocean. And so I talked to a psychologist who is a forensic psychologist who testifies in court. She's done a lot of work involving suicide and mass murder. This case would be both. And I described to her what we know about Zahari, what we know about what happened to the plane. And she said that, indeed, sometimes people do commit suicide in very complicated ways, which this would be a very complicated way to kill yourself. But what people tend not to do is dream up a way of committing suicide that's really, really long. Generally, once people decide to act, to kill themselves, they want to do it quickly. And so to go on this, multi-stage, winding, crisscross pattern across Malaysia and then turning through the Andaman and then going south for 6 hours doesn't really fit, nor does anything we know about Zahari. A lot of people say, well, he was an opposition supporter. A huge part of the country is an opposition supporter. It's like saying, Jeff was a registered Democrat, and then Donald Trump got elected president, so he took the plane and vanished. It doesn't really make any sense, and it doesn't fit. And everyone thought he was like a legitimately caring, helpful, community-minded guy, and it just does not fit with the profile of someone who commits mass murder.
Does hijack really fit the profile and flying to Kazakhstan, though? Because, when people take planes, they usually make demands, and, wouldn't there be some kind of group coming forward, or, why would you take a plane in secret? Have you looked into that?
Well, the other major thing that has happened with this case, as far as I'm concerned, is that a British group called Bellingcat has published a report. They've done a number of reports that sort of have just gradually added weight to their version of events, of which happened with MH17, was that the Buk missile launcher, which everyone pretty much agrees shot down MH17, was not in the hands of a group of militiamen who didn't know what they were doing. It was part of the equipment of a particular military unit, which had come down from Kursk, was encamped on the border, and Bellingcat hasn't been able to find the route that they drove, pictures of the missile launcher, pictures of the individuals in the military unit. And so it seems they've painted a very compelling portrait of an incident in which this missile launcher late at night was driven across the border to Donetsk. Then it was on a flatbed truck, was driven to a village called Snizhny, unloaded from the truck, drove a mile south, parked in a field directly under the filed flight plan path of MH17, waited till the plane flew overhead and shot it down, got loaded back on the truck and driven across the border to Russia in about a 24-hour mission. So what this tells us is that it was not only was it not a rogue bunch of militiamen, it was shot down on orders of the higher ups, but that Russia had planted this counter narrative about the militiamen that was ready to go at the moment the plane was shot down.
And as you pointed out, and I've been looking into myself as well, there was the two Malaysian Airlines that went missing or shot down, and there was only 15 that existed worldwide, right, out of a fleet of sort of 18,000 777s. Yeah.
Right. So to me, that's such an incredible quote unquote coincidence that to me it must have been, I think, a deliberate signal. Like the Russians chose MH17 to shoot down specifically because it was a Malaysian Airlines 777, trying to send some kind of signal. Now, the question you asked me was, why would someone do this? And the answer is, I have no idea. I wouldn't do it. But if you look at it in the context of a Russia which had just the week before invaded and annexed Crimea, was in the process of what was essentially an armed invasion of a neighboring country, but made to look like it wasn't. The Russians are practitioners of what they've termed hybrid warfare, which is attacking not only militarily, but also in a kind of an information sense. So I see MH17 and MH370 as being kind of shows of strength, shows of prowess, shows, and a demonstration, I think, to the West, do not mess with us. And with MH17, it's fairly clear if there was any temptation on the West to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine, it was very clear that nobody wanted to get involved with this mess, where things are being shot down apparently at random. And basically, Putin has created a situation for himself of kind of manufactured chaos where no one could be blamed for anything. And so if the Bellingcat account is correct, and I find it very compelling, the evidence that they've amassed, what you've got is a situation where Putin was able to slaughter, kind of in cold blood, in broad daylight, 298 people, civilians, foreigners, and get away with it, essentially. Now, he did pay a very steep price. The Europeans really came on board with American sanctions after that. But at the same time, I think it was very obvious to everyone that if you're going to get involved in Ukraine, it could get very messy and very bloody.
And plays very well into a counter-narrative that works for him as well. When I say that, what I mean is the Russian economy is focused and has been focused for a long time on far too narrow a base. So there's kind of oil and natural gas and so on, and so they have set up this kind of model of economic progress where those very small sectors are meant to drag the entire economy along behind them, and that worked in the short term. There was a period of prosperity, like a period of economic development just after Putin came in, but it wasn't a good long-term plan, and the economy was showing signs that it was about to fall over. But if you can create a counter narrative, which is that the West and I suppose serving their NATO masters have imposed sanctions on Russia, and that's why the economy has fallen over, and it's not Putin's fault, then that's really working in Putin's favor. And in fact, now living here in the Russian-speaking world, that's what most people think. They think that the problems that have beset the Russian economy are the West's fault. And look here, where I am now, the currency has lost 50% of its value. A year ago, it was the currency here is called the tenge, 180 to the dollar. A year ago, it's now 350 to the dollar, and it's commonly believed that these sanctions are responsible for that, whereas in fact it's actually a kind of a souchon of factors. It's a lot of things, including economic mismanagement, both here and in Russia, and especially in Russia. So he's got now, I think, in a way, it's worked out very well for him to be able to say, look, the West still hate us and are trying to get us like they always have. So yeah, I don't know if this theory is true, but it certainly does play well for Putin.
That's brilliant. I'd never heard that, but I think that's genius. No, it makes a lot of sense actually, because I mean, look at Cuba. They've had sanctions against them for 50 years or whatever, and it just made Castro strong. That's a really intriguing idea. But I think it really points up that the Russians are playing a much more sophisticated game than us, and much more sophisticated than we're capable of seeing. It's been kind of frustrating for me working on MH370 and MH17 and trying to not be perceived as crazy. It's very difficult because you say to people, look, this is what the engineering data tells us is possible, and I can get anyone to look at it. I am really caught in the middle because as the host of this discussion on my blog, I'm caught between people who refuse to say anything that doesn't, go right up and down, very, square, prim, and proper ideas, and people who believe that anything goes. I mean, I have tons of people on my blog who are like, oh, the United States can do anything. They're up to no good. They want to control the world. They have these radars. They have these ships. They can do stuff that we can't even imagine. The plane disappeared. I think it probably just blew up over the South China Sea. I'm like, well, do you have no evidence? But they're like, but I just know, and that to me is a way, even worse than the kind of the indifference of people who just think, oh, your ideas are just not fit for polite company. And so one of the pieces I want to write on my blog in the near future, I've got it sort of half written, is like the curse of reasonableness. There's a lot of people who they hear my ideas and they're like, well, that's not reasonable. And what I want to say to them is, a lot of things in this world aren't reasonable. There was a fur trapper who went out west when the West was all still unknown here in the United States, and he came back and he had tales of like there's this valley where steam shoots up into the air at random, and they called it Coulter's Folly because it was this ridiculous story that wasn't reasonable, because those things just don't happen. Every reasonable person knows those things don't happen. Well, eventually other people went there and they're like, oh yeah, no, it's true. It's called Yellowstone and it's a thing. But for a long time they laughed at him. If you stick to only ideas that are reasonable, you never get anywhere. But I do think with these pieces, it's been interesting to watch the reaction to these pieces wash up. There's another one actually just recently, like this morning. The guy who found the flaperon now found another piece. Strange, you say? Well, maybe so. And anyway, this piece also doesn't have any marine life on it. And so, the anniversary is next week, and you wonder, maybe there's like some kind of a push. And so this piece has now emerged. It has no sea life on it, and as I said, the circumstances under which it was found were slightly odd, and the reaction has been almost unanimously, what the heck is going on? Like, this does not seem right. I think alarm bells are going off all over the place. And so I'm thinking maybe this finally, after hanging on for so long, finally people are starting to say maybe the unreasonable explanation isn't so unreasonable.
There seems to be a lot of confusion about so many of the facts that you see in the media. Like, I've heard that another pilot did try and make contact with MH370 and sort of heard mumblings, and the co-pilot tried to make a phone call. And I was recently flying over the coast of Malaysia in a 777, and I got a signal
Right.
on my mobile phone, quite high up actually. So that made me think. Well, if people were conscious on the plane and it was under any kind of control, and they were flying along the coast of Malaysia at any point, they could have probably made contact.
Well, there was a rumor to that effect. Well, I mean, the 777, the 747 bound for Narita, I think the story was, and this is the kind of story that drives me nuts, because the guy said I don't know if this story even happened or if it was just a internet rumor, but supposedly I called up MH370 and they answered and I heard mumbling and static. Well, how do you know it was MH370 then? It's not like a telephone call where you put a call into a number. It's just so you made a radio call and you heard mumbling in your earpiece. That's ridiculous. Oh, that drives me nuts. But to me, okay, let me put it this way. There are so many weird coincidences in this case. And the question is always, is this a coincidence or is this information? And in my theory about the spoof, what I think I've tried to do is take a lot of these coincidences and collapse them into it's part of the story. So for instance, when the SDU, so the satellite data unit was turned off with everything else when the plane vanished, and then it got turned back on. And I've always said this is one of the hugest clues that's really key to understanding this mystery. Why did that satellite data unit get turned back on? And coincidentally, it was 3 minutes after it disappeared from radar. And I said it wasn't coincidental, is they wanted to leave a breadcrumb trail, a false trail, making it look like they went south. So they fooled around with that satellite data unit and then plugged it back in after they left the radar, so that the SDU data didn't contradict the radar data. But so there was such an avalanche of false information and so many weird narratives that were put forward. You may remember right after it disappeared, there was this organization in Australia called Bright Horizons or something. That's not the name, but I've misremembered it. But anyway, they were saying, we used our high-tech new sensors to locate it underwater off the coast of India, stuff like that. And it was a very well-funded, totally bogus attempt to confuse people, and it was technically ridiculous. And these people had an actual office in Melbourne or someplace. And when you compare it to MH17, where again you see just this spate of ridiculous conspiracy theories, very well doctored photos, and just a fog of misinformation, which you don't typically see in a normal air crash. There was nothing like that in Air France 447. There was nothing like that in AirAsia. Mostly planes crash, everyone scratches their head, and then eventually they figure it out. But when we see this fog of misinformation, to me, it makes me wonder if it's part and parcel, again, something connecting these two crashes.
It makes me think that the Malaysian government did know something. Their reaction has been odd, and it just seems to me like they do know something, and they're sort of having to.
They might.
They're releasing information, but they know something more. I don't know. I just get that feeling anyway.
I think you're right.
Another strange piece of this puzzle has been the attitude of the ATSB, which Jeff, you've said has been mostly positive in your experience. But they do seem to have kind of been open to some alternate theories, quote unquote, but not so much to others. But there was one last year in November. There was the British pilot Simon Hardy who did a recalculation of where he thought the plane might have ultimately ditched, and then the ATSB moved their search area a little bit outside of Arc 7, yeah. And at the time, that was heralded as, okay, this is it. We've found it now. Within 4 weeks, we'll have it on. We'll have the wreckage on a boat. And then it didn't happen. What went on with that? Do you know much about that?
I mean, my interpretation is that I was talking earlier about the curse of reasonableness. I think that the ATSB suffers from the curse of reasonableness. They don't want to have any complicated conspiracies involving Russia. They want to have, let's assume that this data is good data. I think engineers are not skeptical people in general.
Okay.
And just it annoys them, that suggestion that they've been hoaxed. They're not used to it. It never happens, so they don't expect it to happen. They're good, smart, reasonable people who are slightly suffering under a burden of reasonableness. Simon Hardy came, but he said, I basically agree with what you're doing, but I think it's a little bit farther to the south. It's like 50 miles further to the south. And I think what they did was, this guy was starting to kick up a fuss, probably in their heart of hearts realized this wasn't going to work anyway, and they could just shut him up by doing what he said. And they did.
I remember in our first chat, you mentioned that one of the Inmarsat team did use the word hoax, like, could we be being hoaxed here, or words to that effect, yeah.
Yeah, then the Horizon documentary that the BBC did, this guy was on camera saying, at first we wondered if this was real data. I don't know if he used the word hoax. We said we wondered if we'd been fooled, but then we looked at the data and it was fine. And so when I got him on the phone with Miles O'Brien, when Miles was doing an American version of the Horizon documentary, and so we got him on the phone, and I said, how did you know that it wasn't hoaxed? And they said, oh, it just, we don't know. Because of it. And I said, well, it just looked good. The numbers worked out. I'm like, okay. Because the thing is, if you look at the numbers don't really work out. They really don't work out that well. If you just run the probability analysis based on the Inmarsat data alone, you wind up looking north of Broken Ridge. If you include calculations like that involve the autopilot modes that are available, the speeds and so forth, you wind up looking further south, and so that's where they wound up looking. And so people always say, well, how come that? If it was spoofed, how come the BTO and the BFO data line up so well? I said they don't line up that well. I think there's evidence that the Russians did this, and they kind of screwed it up a couple of ways. And one of the ways they screwed it up is they didn't know that Inmarsat was recording BTO values, and so they didn't bother to make the BFO and the BTO line up. And I think ultimately that will be seen to be the case. But the thing is, the BFO it's such a fuzzy value when you're trying to determine a location using it, that you can just say, it's a fuzzy number, right? You can they stopped using it to determine the route because you could get it to conform with anything you want if you have a big enough error bar, which is what happened. I don't think we've talked about the fact that the Malaysians are expecting to issue a second annual report on the 8th of March, which is coming up in a couple days, and we're all on tenterhooks to see what's in it. There's been some fear that they might delay it in order to include this new debris. I hope they don't. I hope they do talk about what the debris tells us.
Is there any sense at this point about what's going to be in the report?
No. One of the guys who's very active and good thinks that they're going to release more radar data. There's long been a suspicion that Thailand and or Indonesia and or maybe even the United States or somebody has radar data that they just didn't want to release, but maybe they've come around and they will release it. If they can show this plane turning south, then the whole Kazakhstan thing kind of comes off the table. But alternatively, maybe they'll show something else. Maybe they'll show it not turning to the south. I don't know. But I feel like it's all pretty well trod over terrain at this point. I'm not really expecting a huge surprise. Okay. Obviously, there's very high hope that they're going to tell us something about the French flaperon. That would be amazing. But it doesn't seem like France and Malaysia have been seeing eye to eye very much on this. And it doesn't seem like the French are subordinating themselves to the Malaysian investigation. This is my interpretation. I think the French are running their criminal investigation as a sovereign investigation, that they're just keeping their information to themselves. But I could be wrong. They went to Malaysia to get information from the Malaysians. Maybe they also gave information to the Malaysians. We'll see. If people have questions or contributions, by all means, visit jeffwise.net. We've got a very active discussion going on. We're always interested in hearing what new voices have to say.
Let's hope some new information does come forth with this report, and there's some information that helps us resolve this for the sake of families and people who fly regularly as well. Thanks for joining us again, Jeff. It's been great chatting to you.
Always a pleasure. Really fascinating talking to you guys. Take care. You too. I'll talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
So thanks for listening. As ever, please visit our website, www.truthsentinel.co.uk, and remember you can comment on what we've talked about and leave a voicemail or write a message in the chat box. You can leave articles in there as well about things you want us to talk about, and you can send us emails at scottsentinel9@gmail.com. We're always interested to hear from you and hear your opinions. Also, check out Conspiracy T-shirts at truthtshirts.com. That's truthtshirts.com, and use the code TRUTH1 to get a 10% discount. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.